Welcome back to GamerSpit, the show where I talk shop on the topic of gaming and hopefully give you some insight into how you can enjoy more of your time spent playing video games. Today, we're discussing the top 10 ways that platinum rarities can be deceptive. Because the picture painted by trophy statistics is rarely black and white, and because I'm one of those data nerds, I figured it might be helpful to take a look at some of the assumptions we're all guilty of making, and try feeling a little less intimidated or put off by how rare a particular platinum might be. And if you're not already sorting your trophy view by rarity, now's a good time to do so. With that, let's get into the list. Number 1. Inaccessible or dead multiplayer. We should probably start with the most obvious offender. If you've been chasing trophies for pretty much any length of time these days, you've probably jumped away from a game when all you had left were the multiplayer trophies. Maybe you needed a break from a really grindy one. Maybe you were waiting on a good time to jump into the online action with some friends. Or maybe you just weren't feeling like playing multiplayer when you reached that roadblock, since our backlog's forever increasing in size. And these are only a few of the possible reasons as to why many players leave easy platinum chases looking tough simply because most gamers are failing to complete the multiplayer chase. Was it actually tough? It damn sure is now, since the multiplayer is pretty much dead, or perhaps even offline completely. My rarest trophy is actually just an online game I grinded out during the few months it had a solid player base. But that's the minority of what tends to happen for most of us. So we all have a tendency to make games with multiplayer trophies look like monsters in terms of rarity, when they're more like lone skunks which crossed the road and never returned. Number 2. Only trophy hunters or niche obsessives play the game. I don't know if you know this, but plenty of gamers seem to enjoy keeping the most brutal of experiences as a conversational ace in the hole, only to be spoken of when an appropriately masochistic gamer company. So though it's more rare than most entries on this list, there are some times when you'll see a game with a high completion rate and think, I got this, only to realize it's one of the hardest video games you'll ever play. Worse yet is when you're well into the thick of it before it starts to dawn on you that the only way people manage what the game demands is with some sort of exploit which absolutely none of the game's devotees have made available to the public. Believe it or not, I can assure you this still happens much more than it should, and the why of its occurrence should be pretty obvious. The gamers who've completed it don't want anyone to know that they cheated their way through the hell everyone else thinks the game is. It gives them clout, however false that may be when a normal person eventually decides to spill the beans. As an aside, this is a prime example of why caring about completion score is a sure way to have a bad time with this hobby. Number 3. Not all components of the game are popular. There are countless examples of this happening. Some games offer a single player alongside multiplayer, and rarely are they both cultural phenomenons. Some have multiple character journeys, yet one is routinely overlooked. Some task you with both playing and creating levels in a community setting, even though you're likely only interested in one or the other. But my favorite example continues to be in the realm of instrument simulation games like Rock Band or Guitar Hero. Drums? I'll give it a shot. Bass? Not that different from what I came here to do. Guitar? I mean, have we met? But vocals? For a lot of people, vocals aren't something they can simply apply that get good gamer logic and belt out some Whitney Houston with a bit of practice. We're talking about a part of human physiology which leaves many at a disadvantage in this arena. So yeah, you might be looking at the impossible task and rightly assuming it's impossible, if it isn't cheesable of course. Or it could be that so many people expect a hate part of something that they never give it a fair shake. In which case that plat you're eyeing could be way easier than the numbers would have you believe. Number 4. Early adopters. A deep look at all manner of artistic mediums will eventually make plain that the first creators to do something new are rarely the most popular. This is why we even have a category of overlooked winners in entertainment known as cult classics. What happens is that only a few people are exposed to the origination point of something awesome. They start spreading the word, but before said thing can blow up the way it rightfully should, someone else comes along, usually with a bunch of money for marketing, and makes something wildly popular, riffing off the idea of that original creator. Timing can also be to blame for these oversights and stellar experiences. Like it or not, our species is hell-bent on constant consumption of new things, and that quest for finding what's around the next corner, we lose sight of treasures hidden where we already are. This is why games which were the first to adopt trophies back on the PS3 and games released early in any system's life cycle tend to be on the rarer side in terms of plat pops. When trophies were brand new, most players didn't think to care about them, or were actively repulsed by the mere idea of them. And console launch titles get played by a lot of gamers who still aren't interested in trophies. They're simply playing the games in question because of a limitation in available options. So I'd actively encourage trophy hunters to take any early adopter completion rates with a grain of salt, as they're almost certainly easier to complete than the numbers make them seem. Contrarily, some trophy obsessives hit the occasional early adopter game with brute force, and make a 7 out of 10 on the difficulty scale give the impression of a 2. This can be especially true of the first games to ever get trophies, and this is where I'd tell you to do your homework, but the fact is that many early guides were written and scored long before those almost impossible to miss plats were even thought up. Also, guide writers sometimes have a tendency to underscore or overscore the difficulty rating, so I guess what I'm saying is you may need to make up your own mind when it comes to early adopters. Number 5. The game was free and had tons of casual players. If you haven't considered what the bandwagon effect does to trophy rarity, this might feel like the word duh just lit up in your head. Most easily seen in the games Sony gives away to Plus subscribers each month, free games tend to look much tougher to complete than they should. Same goes for free-to-play games. The reason this is the reality is that lots of people are quickly jumping on and off the bandwagon when it comes to free games. All those casuals just giving the game a shot because it's free, why not? We're probably never going to chase a platinum trophy. And so the plat gets rarer and rarer with each fair weather player who comes, only to quickly leave. This isn't to say you're guaranteed an easy time just because the game was or is free, but it does mean that the time you'll have is easier than it looks when compared to most similar games which have never been playable without a price tag. This is another thing which helped make my rarest platinum trophy seem so rare. I had free access, so I tried it out, and when I realized I dug the gameplay and wasn't struggling to pop trophies, I kept pushing well beyond the challenge and grind most people clearly couldn't be bothered with. Suddenly a game I wouldn't even rank in my top 10 hardest platinums is looking like King of the Hill. Thing was like a 4 on the difficulty scale. But yeah, that's what happens with free games. Number 6. The plat is popular to chase, even though it's hard. I touched on this a bit earlier in the video, but it's worth some deeper consideration. And this one doesn't just apply to niche players either, but trophy hunters in general. Bloodborne comes to mind as the prime example. Its platinum completion rate last I checked was around 7%. You might see that figure and think, oh hell, 1 in 14 players have the plat? Half of that number doesn't even count when you omit the casuals, so we're talking more like 1 in 7 players? I can handle that. But what you're not accounting for there is that the trophy hunting community thinks of this game as a golden child. It's respected. It's popular to chase, with lots of players enduring levels of torment they otherwise wouldn't if not for the fact that they don't want to be a trophy hunter who tried for Bloodborne's plat and failed. But they used reasoning much like your own when beginning their chase and have fallen victim to a sunk cost fallacy well ahead of recognizing that the completion rate is likely as high as it is because it's a popular shiny to have. Few things are more demoralizing in the realm of video games than giving up on a platinum you worked your ass off for, so you keep pushing. And before long, you're another player who's conquered the climb, perpetuating the statistical notion that getting it really wasn't that bad. The reality? It was a beating. For the sake of transparency, allow me to clarify, I don't have Bloodborne's platinum, nor do I have much experience with the game, so I could be completely off base with this example, but hopefully you get the thrust of what I'm saying. Number 7. Maybe the game just sucks. Perhaps you've been wanting to check out a game and have hopes of platting it. You check the trophy stats and it looks rare. Some players will feel more driven by this, while other players will feel more cautious of a steep challenge. In any case, you decide to eyeball one of the game's trophy guides. The difficulty rating is low, and it won't take much time to complete. It's never been free to play, there's no multiplayer, etc. You rack your brain and come up with nothing as to why the game in question is so rarely completed. And it's not until after you've turned it on before the awful truth becomes glaringly apparent. The plat is rare because the game straight up sucks. Maybe the game isn't a complete loss, hell, maybe it's even good for a time, but eventually you hit that point at which everything becomes repetitive or the game starts to feel unfinished. There are probably lots of other ways you could think of in which games are capable of becoming boring or bad, even if they don't start out that way, and you hate to see it. But sometimes that completion rate you find is rarer than it ought to be, for no better reason than that the game in question wound up turning players off from even bothering to continue on with it. Number 8. The game is very short, but very hard, or very long, but very easy. While I've been staring at trophy stats long enough to know that people are more forgiving of difficulty than they are of time to plat, this is still one of the biggest considerations you should keep in mind when looking to make quick judgments about a game's true potential for hardships. Inherent in this notion is knowing where you fall on the spectrum of time required versus necessary skill. Maybe like myself, you've no interest in chasing an easy plat in a mediocre game if the time required is more than 5 hours. Or maybe you're comfortable tackling 9s and 10s on the difficulty scale, so long as the plat can be had in as little as 10 minutes. Although it's true that difficult trophy chases tend to be tied to some of the longest games, this is not a foregone conclusion. There are loads of examples of completely doable plats which look rare only because players were asked to give these games 50 to 100 hours of their free time. When they fail to afford said time sink to the games in question, the rarity of those plats increase. And some people mistakenly think they can handle brutally tough challenges in the shortest games, only to give up when they tire of having the floor mopped with their blistering thumbs. This too increases the rarity of completion. But these increases in rarity aren't telling us the same thing. In these examples, the short games are rightfully rare, but the long games seem rarer than they should in terms of sheer difficulty. So if you have the time and wherewithal to chase longer plats, you're likely to find that many of them are easier to achieve than their rarity lets on. Number 9. Dang old trophy patch. Though it almost never happens nowadays, I'm old enough to remember just how dirty trophy patches could do us hunters way back when. The worst was when you'd already played a game to death, just to have trophies get patched into the experience once you'd moved on to a new game. Because there were no trophies at launch, when the game saw its largest player counts, and because so many gamers didn't return for the trophy chase, this left trophy patched games in a pretty niche position. Unless an underexposed game saw some massive uptick in player counts as the result of a sale, what you'd be looking at, and still are to this day, is what the numbers look like when it's only enthusiasts and trophy hunters who are playing. It's a lot like looking at game stats on PSN profiles versus what you might see if looking at the actual PSN trophy stats. The difference being that the PlayStation Network accounts for all players, while the PSN Profiles site will only show you stats for players who've chosen to sync their trophy list to that particular site, something non-trophy hunters are unlikely to ever do. So it tends to be the case that games which started out with no trophies, only to get them later, are more difficult than the raw numbers would lead you to quickly conclude. By way of comparison to non-patched games, I mean. Still, there are a handful of games with patches which are so criminally underplayed that this particular knife swings in the opposite direction. Determining what's what is a struggle, which again is why I'd encourage you to ignore your overall completion score and just try the game out until you know whether or not its trophy chase is right for you. Number 10. The sunk cost problem. This idiot's already talked about sunk cost, you may be thinking, or shouting at the screen depending on your personality type, which you do you, boo-boo. I'm not throwing shade. Thing is, when I say sunk cost in this section, I mean it literally. Humans have a natural tendency to overvalue bad experiences if they cost us a lot of money, and undervalue good experiences if they cost us little or nothing. It's not universally applicable, mind you. The money schemes which exist in the modern gaming scene are so manipulative that players may not even realize how much money they've spent in or on certain games. But the fact is that the more we spend, the more likely we are to keep playing something, even if the experience is difficult or bad. Thus, it naturally follows that the more a game asks of our wallets, the more likely it is to see better completion rates than cheaper titles with similar content offerings. Yet another thing which can make a difficult trophy chase seem unreasonably easy when considering only the completion statistics. And with so many variables to consider in this little thought experiment of mine, it's easy to see why certain platinum unlock rates can be such head scratchers. Simply put, there's a lot to consider, and odds are I failed to account for some of what there is to consider. While most numbers do reflect something in the way of reliability, there are plenty of strange paths they're capable of having taken. And because you can't always see the storied histories of those numbers, it's best to prepare yourself for things not always being what they initially seem. But that's my perspective. Let me know yours in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more content, because gamers, there's a lot more of this spit to come.